job requirements are, and if you're looking at survey data, look at what your job does versus what the jobs in the survey do, and really match it. So it's not without work and challenges either, but it's definitely being seen more as the way to go with the starting point of this. I believe there are really three types of pay structures, these three types of pay structures that are possibilities for what you can develop in terms of your structure. The top one, and this is just my own terminology, is what I will call pure market pricing. It's almost like the no structure structure. What this means is that in a pure market pricing situation, what you do is you pull in the survey data for all of the jobs in your organization, and you build a pay range for every single job in your organization. Every job has its own pay range. And actually what I probably need to do when I talk about pay structure, basically all three of these types of pay structures involve pay ranges. And what a pay range is, if we look back at the restaurant example that I used earlier, and we had sort of three levels in our hierarchy, well, let's just take the bartender, kind of the middle job, as an example. If we then look at bartenders, we will of course find out that there are bartenders who are just starting out at bartending, or you've got your bartender who's been doing it for like 20 years. And as we might imagine, those two people, even though they're both bartenders, are probably not making the same amount of money. We've got to assume the person who's been doing it for 20 years is making more than the entry-level person. And so basically what a pay range does is, within your structure, it takes into account the fact that there's a range for that job from your entry level to your highly experienced person. So there's typically a minimum and a maximum. We're going to look at pay ranges real quick here. But so in your pay structure, you've always got pay ranges built in. So in a pure market pricing situation, what you've got is a pay range unique to every single job in your organization. I actually have been in a situation where we had used pure market pricing. We had 900 unique jobs. Every one of those 900 jobs had its own pay range. In terms of, and because we were a big company and we had access to really good survey data, those were, good. The data was very good. Everything was very competitive. From the standpoint of being able to identify competitive pay for each of those 900 unique jobs, it was very effective. But as you might imagine, maintaining 900 pay ranges from year to year to year was really a bit too much administrative effort. So they're no longer managing it quite that way anymore, because it was just too much to manage. So in a smaller organization, certainly pure market pricing can definitely work for you. And I have a client right now where I've basically set that up because they only have like 30 unique jobs, and it works. So that's one possibility. The one in the middle, pay grade structure, and that's the one we'll really talk the most about this evening. A pay grade structure, it's the end result whether you start with the internal equity and job evaluation or you start with market pricing. You can end up with a pay grade structure, and we're going to really look at that one in detail because that is still the most common, certainly, type of pay structure used. And that's basically a lot of grades or pay ranges in a hierarchy. The last one is something called broadbanding. It's had its momentary sort of flashes of, ooh, this is the latest, greatest thing to be invented in, compensation in years. Never has really quite caught on popularly. I'm not a fan of it personally. Had a bad experience with it myself. What broadbanding is, it's basically it's a pay grade structure, but it's got very few grades. They call the grades bands instead of grades, just to be different. But it's got very few grades or bands, And the difference from the top to the bottom of the range is much, much wider. So from the minimum pay to the maximum pay of your pay range can often be 100% or more. So it's much broader than you would find in a traditional pay grade structure. The bad situation that I was involved in with a broad banding situation, I was working with an IT group, and in our organization at the time, all the IT people, there were a number of grades in our hierarchy into which various IT jobs fell. Some of them were what are called job ladders, where you could essentially stay, like help desk had maybe 3 ladders, so 3 different grades. And as you became more experienced and took on more independence as a help desk person, you could move up to the other grades. So we had a number of those kind of ladders in our job grade structure. And so our IT people had been pretty accustomed to seeing fairly regular promotions on up the grades, you know, up, which was really not in the long run. It's not a sustainable thing. It can't go on forever. And I think somebody in the organization must have realized that this couldn't go on forever, so they decided they were going to change the situation and took all these people in this IT group who had been looking at all these promotions, you know, had this expectation built in, threw them into a broad banding scheme where there were basically 2 bands that they were in. Those people, most of those people looked at that band, and they're down here toward the minimum end of the band, and the band goes way up to here, which would be nice if they could ever make that much money, but boy, they probably weren't going to get that kind of pay increase. But you know what that did? That meant they were never going to see a promotion. And in our organization, a promotional increase standard 5% increase on top of your current salary for every promotion that you got. They saw overnight those 5% promotional increases evaporate. And there was no structure, there was nothing to show them how, other than their typical merit increase, typically 3%, how they were ever going to get any more boosts in salary like they'd been accustomed to seeing in the past. Needless to say, this was a big morale issue. And these are the kind of things you really have to watch out for when you're doing compensation design, especially if you're changing an existing program, is what kind of impacts, how what you're doing is going to feel to the employees when you roll this thing out. The communications around is obviously very key. I mean, there was minimal communications about this when there were no sort of processes put in place. There was nothing to deal with this whole issue that all those 5% promotional increases are just gone. So it was a very ugly, ugly situation morale-wise. We finally got the folks out of the broadband, but that's the kind of thing where with broadbanding it's difficult because people don't see themselves making to the top end of the scale. So from an employee standpoint, it has some issues in that regard. The other thing, from a company's standpoint, broadbanding, because that range is so wide, if you have somebody who remains with the organization for a very long time, they can continue to get pay increases forever, as long as they stay there. They may have never enhanced their skill set one bit from the day they came into your organization, and yet they continue to get all these pay increases through this band because there's nothing that says your job's not worth more money, which, as we'll talk about, you'll find, you know, with a more limited structure, the maximum, you can't go past it. The job's not worth it. So a company can end up paying a lot more money to employees who really aren't putting out for it under a broadbanding scheme, so really paying way over the competitive marketplace for a certain skill set. So there's really, if you want to go into a broadbanding thing, there's really some things you really have to pay attention to, and I think that's why it hasn't caught on much. Mm-hmm.
So what would the benefit be of the broadbanding?
One of the theories that they had when they put our IT people in, for example, was that if you want your organization to be, with a lot of the IT folks, the skill sets change so fast that ideally you would like to have the folks do a lot of cross-training and be able, as you move from project to project, to have people be, freely move from one project to another and do different types of roles, to just have a really broad skill set so that to the organization they can be valuable in a lot of different places and a lot of different functions on different projects. So in the kind of environment where you have a lot of technical folks and you have a lot of project work, where you would like them to become very developed in a lot of different skills and freely move between roles, it can be good, because what we're trying to do is get away from the idea that the titles have the hierarchy, the very hierarchy the pay grade structure has. It does away with that by putting a lot of people into a big sort of lump. And what that can do, I mean, we had folks, I forget, systems engineers would never accept a role on a project that could be filled by a programmer, because I am a systems engineer. That's not what I do. And literally, I mean, that was the attitude that these folks had. So if you've got that in the organization and you're trying to move people around very freely, which is obviously a very productive situation for your organization, this can work from the standpoint of getting rid of some of that hierarchical thinking. Mm-hmm.
It also was developed to help with the issue of management. What happens in a lot of technical fields is we take the good technical people who want to make more money and we move them into management. We have not trained them to be managers, and they don't want to manage. They just want to be very good at this technical skill. So this whole idea of broadbanding came out of technical areas like information technology, where what you could do is have a band that is large enough in pay to allow the person who is of great value to the company with the skill set they have and who is willing to continue to develop their technical skills as technology changes and make as much money as the manager does. Then those people who really want to be managers, you train and promote to be managers. But you aren't, because of pay, forcing someone to move into a management position. So, a lot of times, haven't you taken a job sometimes just because of the pay and you needed more money for your lifestyle, but you didn't really want to do that job? And so that's one of the reasons we have so many poor managers out there, is because they were excellent in their technical field, and so we promote them. And promoting them is not a good decision. But if we can find a way to still tell them how valuable they are to us and to still incent them to continue to develop those technical skills without moving into management, earning more money, then they're going to stay with us. So that's where broadbanding really makes a lot of sense. People started getting crazy with broadbanding, and it really doesn't work for every job family. Okay?
Mm-hmm. And it's funny too, because as you talk about it, one area where it would probably work really well, and I haven't seen it applied, is actually in sales. Because that's an area where sales reps do not, from most of my experience, really good sales reps do not make good managers. And we were constantly putting them into those roles because it was the only place where they could make money. And I've really never seen it used there, but it actually would probably work very, very well in that kind of environment for that very reason. So those are the three types of structures. As I said, we will, because the pay grade structure, the traditional one, is certainly the most commonly used. That's the one we're really going to focus on for the rest of our discussion here. And what this is basically, it is sort of a 2-grade slice of a pay grade structure. So it's 2 pay ranges, this one being the next highest pay range in pay after the one at the top. So these are what a typical sort of pay range would look like, and a little bit of what a typical structure would look like. I used this top one with the 80, 100, 120 because those are nice round numbers that we can easily do the math on if need be. So what you will see at the top, you'll see the minimum, the midpoint, and the maximum. This is typically what every pay range has. Minimum being the least that you will pay for that job. Maximum, ideally, being the most that you will pay for that job. Some organizations have a hard time drawing the line with that. Red line? No, you all call it something else. Red circle. We call it red line, but it's red circle in the textbooks now. Some organizations have a hard time drawing that line, but that's a separate class, I think, from this one. I just design it. How they enforce it is their own issue. I only recommend. And then the one in the midpoint in the middle, typically if your philosophy is to pay competitively with the marketplace, the midpoint is the number that you will pull from the salary survey data. It would be set at typically either the average or the mean average, or the median of the survey data. The midpoint represents what a fully competent person in that job would be paid in the marketplace. So you really work with the midpoints, you pull those from your salary survey data, and you build the range mathematically around your midpoint. So you build your structure with the midpoints, and then you just create the minimums and maximums off of that afterwards. In this particular example, what this one is showing is we have a midpoint of 100,000 for this top one. Typically, what companies will do or have done is they would set the minimum at 80% of the midpoint. So in this case, 80% of 100 is 80,000. And then they would typically set the maximum at 120% of the midpoint. So in this case, 120 is 20% more than 100. So that one's with easy math. But that's typically 20% up, 20% down is how you would typically build your pay range. What that results...
I have a question. Okay, so you see how they got that minimum presented or whatever, and then you go apply for the job, and then they hire you. Do they necessarily have to start you out with that minimum that they start at?
Well, you know, it depends on the company. The companies that I've worked for, we absolutely enforce the minimum, and we would not bring anybody in below that. Some of the clients that I've worked with, some of them have adopted that philosophy, some of them can't quite get there. And sometimes there's a reason. I had one company that I built the pay structure for, did all the market pricing for in Greensboro. And when we started out and I said, what's your pay philosophy? It was to pay above the market. And we think that's where we are. As soon as we got all the salary survey data consolidated, what we discovered was that they were going to have to change their philosophy because they were so not at the competitive market, they couldn't possibly afford to suddenly become more than competitive. They actually had so many people below minimum that they made a decision they could not move everybody to minimum. They couldn't even afford to do that, not all at once. So what some companies will do is go, okay, they know this is the minimum, but this person maybe doesn't have quite all of everything we're looking for, or whatever their rationale is. I'm not always sure what the rationale is, but that they will at least give them an accelerated pay increase program. So that's really what I've discussed, and all of my clients have at least committed to, is that if they can't bring everybody to the minimum immediately, or they hire folks in a little below minimum, they have a specific accelerated pay increase plan in place. But do they have to? No. I mean, it's the company's decision. But generally, they try to at least get there in a short, couple of years.
Usually, if you're going to pay under your minimum, you have a training wage. And when the person becomes skilled in the job, then they might move to the minimum. But you have to be consistent in doing that. Otherwise,